I arrived here, and so I'm starting with this, but I'm going to back it up, okay? And then I'm hoping to have enough time for a little activity that involves all of you before my 20 minutes here.
Yeah, I will go like this
okay.
in about half an hour.
Okay, so this image, lingua franca, spoken here, is an image that I've been using to brand this concept of a project that involves a consideration of English, the use of English as a global language, a lingua franca. By definition, lingua franca means a language that's adopted as a common language between speakers of all different languages, finding the lingua franca so that you can communicate. And currently English appears to be the lingua franca. It won't be in the future, probably. It'll change. It wasn't in the beginning. The term was coined in the late 17th century to describe the language that was used for trade in the Mediterranean. And it wasn't English. It was Frankish. And so that's how this kind of came about. So, all right, that's where we're going. And this is the backstory. So I'm trained as a painter, painting and drawing. I teach in the foundations program. I had done a series of paintings, or was working on a series of paintings based on vintage paint by numbers. And it's came out of basically the ruins of a failed arts grant that was about the auction in Majorville, which I couldn't really get off the ground with the way that I was thinking about presenting it. So anyway, that crashed and burned. And this is kind of what came out of that, is the completed cycle of 12 diptychs based on vintage paint by numbers. And this show is actually, I will have a show of this finally at the UNB Art Center on May 25th. So anyway, last fall when I was finishing this up, that's my first oil painting of Bambi, by the way, ever. Most of these I did not do, but yeah, my first painting, this vintage painting, is my vintage painting that I actually did do. So I used this work when I needed to apply, I needed work to apply to residencies last fall for the following spring. So I was trying to find a place to go. I found a residency in Assisi that looked good. I needed to pitch a proposal. I used paintings because that's what I had just done. I had been to Assisi before, and I had been to, this is the residency, one of the sites of the residency. I had been to the Basilica, the St. Francis Basilica, and I was interested in these beautiful murals. It's 28, a little bit pixelated, 28, it's a cycle of 28 paintings from the 1300s, attributed to Giotto and others. Everybody's fighting about who made these. Anyway, so I pitched a painting proposal, and I went to Italy with this.
Using paint by numbers.
Yeah. So yeah, so I'm trying to tell this story, this convoluted, sort of backstory. So before I went to Assisi, I went to Portugal with my kids. And I also had pitched some other proposals for other residencies in the same kind of time frame, that same year. And one of the things that I had pitched was sort of about climate change, and the residencies were in coastal towns. Started thinking about maps, how major cities all over the world, for the most part, many of them are going to be underwater. And anyway, so we went on a holiday basically to Portugal, and I had another week in Italy where I was going to Venice to the Biennale, and I started taking pictures of doors with numbers. Everybody does this, I think, when they go to Lisbon because they're so beautiful. And so I was kind of in the back of my mind thinking, oh, this might become something. I might make something out of these photographs, this idea of a countdown, coastal cities, these areas that will be underwater sometime in the future, Venice. Anyway, this is a little bit actually a sidebar. So then I went to Venice. And I went to the Biennale, and this is Lorenzo Quinn's work. He's from Barcelona. It's called Support. So there were a number of people thinking, obviously, about climate change and sea level rising, and I found that really, like, part of the reason I wanted to go is because I was aware of this particular piece, and I wanted to see also what was happening in the Canada Pavilion, which was Jeffrey Farmer's piece. And the pieces that really resonated with me, though, had to do with language. And it also had to do with the language of the presentation of the Biennale, the fact that everything was in every pavilion for every country was in English, and then it was in Italian. So, for example, this is Carlos Amorales of Mexico. And his piece, he made an alphabet, and then he printed magazines using this alphabet, this language that he invented to basically to avoid censorship in Mexico. So his piece, there's so many layers to this piece. His piece was about avoiding censorship by not using his language. And meanwhile, the presentation of the piece, when I walked in, the presentation is in English and Italian, so there's no Spanish whatsoever involved in the presentation of the piece. Anyway, so I kept, this all resonated with me, that the presentations and these artists were working in English. And this is called Proper Time. This is one of the pieces by Lee Wan in the South Korean Pavilion. And again, his title is in English, the explanation is in English. This piece, actually, the clocks are turning, and there's 668 clocks that represent an individual in the world and the time it takes for them to work to earn a meal. So kind of global considerations. Issues of globalization and also migration, and all in English. So this is called The Absence of Paths. This is the Tunisian pavilion, and there were kiosks set up. You're invited to come and with your thumb create a passport for yourself, which gave you access to the world. It's a borderless passport. It feels like a real passport, and then you walk away with that document. And here's me at the border using my all-access pass. So this also, again, this is Tunisia. It was presented in English. Everyone was speaking in English. The absence of paths really didn't make any sense to me. Like, it's kind of, I felt like something was lost in the translation of that project. I mean, I loved it. It was my favorite project, but it's called Frisia. You can see Frisia, and then the absence of paths. So it's English, but it's not what I would have, you know what I mean, in terms of the translation of what the concept was. So I just kept thinking about this. And I was remembering a piece from the 90s. This is Yanagi Yukinori. It's called World Flag Ant Farm. Does anybody remember this? So he, this is when I was in grad school. So he, this artist took basically colored sand and made world flags, connected them with tubes, and then put the ants in there. And so the ants eventually, well, you know what they did, right? They spread so they so globalization, sort of a visual of the way that sort of interconnected contact between countries affects cultures. At least that's my interpretation of it. So I grew up here, and I have this puzzle. Do you notice anything about this? What's missing?
Well, any other country in the world.
Right. Thank you. There's zero context, right? So the context at the borders, right, north and south, for example, the United States is just floating in space, in the ocean. Here's the weather map of the United States. Like, I don't know how this resonates with you, but when I moved to Canada, it's the flip side, right? It's the B side, I don't know. No judgment. But I grew up with Maine, Maine, weather map of Maine, and nothing, dragons, I don't know, falling off the edge of the world. And I feel that it had an impact on me in terms of my worldview. And I feel strongly that it has an impact currently on the protectionism, isolationism, and myopic view of this country. And also Great Britain, Brexit. So just as English, not just this moment is English, but English has this world domination as a lingua franca, you can arrive anywhere in the world and kind of expect to be accommodated in English somehow, right? And nobody else gets to do that, really. And we take it for granted, especially, people from here. And especially if you don't go anywhere else. So anyway, this is all, I'd been away for 3 weeks, and I'd had these experiences, and I was looking at all this artwork that was sort of globally sort of oriented, and it's all in English, and I'm in Italy. And I was looking at maps, and our map and our globe is based on basically a projection from 1569. It's what I grew up with. It's what most of you grew up with. It's the globe that right? So the proportions of the continents, the proportions of the ice masses, and the water, it's all distorted. And so there have been attempts to change that. This is a map called the Gall-Peters projection from 1885, which, sort of just looking at that changes, if you consider it, changes, think about that American map, right? The map of the United States. It puts things in a different perspective. Last year, this map won a design award in Japan, and this is Nurakara is his last name. He's an architect from Japan, and he's using these individual units that really minimize the distortion of land masses and sort of the poles and water. And so, anyway, I find this fascinating, and it's really disorienting. But apparently, it's actually the most accurate, right? It's unfamiliar graphically, but it is the most accurate depiction of our planet in terms of scale that we currently have. So the United States, Great Britain, English everywhere. So then I finally got back to I got to the residency in Italy. All these things I'm thinking about. And I arrive, and I'm supposed to go look at the Giotto frescoes and do something, but I'm not interested in that anymore. So I continued to think about language. I went to the Basilica every day, and I was thinking about, you know, sort of language. And I ended up one day in a linen shop. Oh, that's really not a great picture. But I was in a linen shop and wound up translating between this group of English men and the shop owner who spoke only Italian. I don't speak Italian, but I don't know, somehow I was so plugged into this language idea that I actually successfully brokered, you know, she's going to be back at 2 o'clock after lunch. You guys can go get a drink and come back. It happened. I don't even know how it happened. So I asked the Ginistrel studio where I was, I asked if I could do something interactive with language for my project. And they said no. Because in Assisi you need like 12 permits and a year in advance notice for the commune, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you're not allowed to do anything outside of your house, basically. So I wasn't allowed to go down to the square and, you know, sort of have conversations with everybody who was walking by and ask them about language and do they speak English and how do they come to speak. This is what I wanted to do, but I wasn't allowed to do it. So I made a sign in Italian. Thank you for speaking English with me. And I placed it in front of these 2 chairs outside my studio, and I called it good. And then I came home. Oh, look who's there. And I did a little bit more research on language because I didn't want it to be about, thank you for speaking English with me was not what I wanted to say, but that's kind of what I meant. I wanted to talk about the use of English, but I wanted to talk about it differently so it didn't feel like it was me sort of with my dominant language. So I guess that's how I found lingua franca as a term, which is English, but it also could be a number of other things. And so it appeals to me in that way. So in New Brunswick, we're bilingual. Settler languages are bilingual, but original languages are, we have a couple of those at least. And then we have a lot of other languages that have arrived here. And so talking to people, besides Chase, at the Fredericton Arts Alliance this summer, and then the Bridge Project this fall, I was able to kind of go further with this idea and hear stories about how people have come to speak English. There really can be really interesting stories. And it's rare, but it happens, of course, that someone's family, everyone always spoke English. That happens. But in North America, or at least in my experience in New Brunswick, that's not really true. It's way different than that usually. And so with a couple of questions, this is us on the bridge. With a couple of questions, we're able to find out a whole lot more about the context in which we find ourselves speaking English. And I find it astounding how many different ways we come to that. And we just, especially if you speak English as your first language, you just walk through the world just assuming that's just taking it for granted. So for me personally, my great-grandparents all emigrated to New York, via New York to Connecticut. So I have relatives in Sweden and Germany, cousins, second cousins, for whom English is obviously not their first language. So just on a personal note, I don't have to go back very far to find and to think about that. Like if my, great-grandfather hadn't emigrated, like he'd be on the farm back in Sweden. I don't know, like it's it's really close, right? It can be really close. And in interviewing people this summer, the stories were crazy. Like this one person that came through, Chase is nodding his head, but one person came through and talked to me and us, and his grandfather had emigrated from Russia, or escaped Russia, and eventually made his way to Canada. And then we said, well, what about your father? And he said, no, he speaks English. He always spoke English. But then he said, wait a minute, he was with my grandfather in Russia when he was 5, and they escaped together. So it's like, well, did he speak Russian? It's like, yeah, he must have, but I never heard him. My grandfather died before I was born, so I never heard them speak Russian together. So it's just erased from his family, like recent memory, like memory in this generation. Anyway.
The Italy guy was cool too, like the little Italy. I don't know if you remember that.
Tell it, I can't remember.
His family was from Italy, and then they ended up in like Ontario in this little town that they call Little Italy, and so I think they immigrated in like 1920, and I guess this little town is like exactly like Italy would have been in 1920, because they never what's the word?
Modernized?
Yeah, like with Italy.
Right.
They just brought their culture and they just kind of stayed like that.
Yeah, and
So I guess like if you go to this little space in Ontario, it's like walking through Italy because
people who study linguistics, I've heard this before, there are pockets in North America of immigrants where the language has stayed static. For example, Swedish and Norwegian.
Yeah, too. They speak different.
It's the old Italian, right? But meanwhile, back home, it's been modernized potentially. I don't know. So here's the thing. This is pretty much as far as I've gotten with this, and I've thought of all different kinds of interfaces that would be visual or something, a video or interactive, but I keep coming back to like having the conversation with somebody and sort of the one-to-one sharing of a story it remains the most kind of vital part of it. There's not really anything else. Like you could make graphs or graphics or some kind of big installation, like some of the ones that were at the Biennale, for example. But really at the core of what interests me about this is just kind of sharing stories and then finding out, sort of change, maybe kind of a paradigm shift about how English, what is English? How do we use English? How do we assume that we get to use English? And how does that affect how does that affect us as global citizens? Yeah, so that's kind of where I still am at with this. And so I have a questionnaire for you. So find a partner. Turn off the lights.
So, please take those out. One each?
So how are you?
Am I going to close it? When do I have to actually close it?
We should be wrapping up. The tables are all done, so like quarter of, we should really kind of try to close it down. You need more time now?
Give it until like the lull goes down, like 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'll just ask if anybody wants to
Speak to them.
Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then I'll just, I mean, if it stretches, I'll just drop it at 10.
Yeah.
And then we just file out this door. And that the tables are all set up.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier in terms of on scans.
That hasn't happened.
Yeah. So you've got them into your art piece now, right?
Well, okay, so this is, if I just do all the interviews, I think this is much better if two people, especially strangers.
Right.
That's kind of my concept, is if you had an installation where you could either hear somebody's story and then leave yours, or actually two people share their stories on either side of, I don't know. But I think this is better than just one person.
Right.
Because it's more about,
And then what do you do with this?
Right.
Big challenge.
I have no idea. But if you were at a artist-run center, and you had the space, and you could set up telephones or chairs, or you would invite people into the space, and then you would explain this to them, and then they would participate, and that would be it. That would be the thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And I feel like that actually is the thing. And I was thinking, like at the Biennale, with so many people coming through, they're from all over the world, and if they could interact around this language thing. It was so obvious to me that the English, it was just this weird thing where all these countries had to like represent themselves in English. It's sucky for them.
Yeah, until we get these chip implants, we...
Auto translation?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of a wild, I don't know.
It's been since cave times.
Communication.
Yeah.
Right?
One cave to another, no less the other, one mountain to another.
One tribe to another. I know. Sign language is a universal language, if you know sign language, right?
Right.
And I went to that Artist Run Center conference in PEI this fall.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a deaf artist who presented, and she presented about accessibility for the deaf community in the arts.
Right.
And that was also a paradigm shift, because we never accommodate deafness.
Right.
So there's some artists that are left out, and they know it.
Yeah.
And they're doing pieces about it.
Right.
Yeah. And that was fascinating. I thought.
And there used to be more talk about some language that was being promoted, and it was a new language.
Yeah, Brenda was just saying the Baha'i community is promoting a universal language. I came across it when I was doing research, but I didn't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I thought there was this. Well, I didn't know that Baha'is were connected, but it was some kind of Spanish-English mix.
Would be franca, like the original lingua franca, Spanish, English, Italian, Arabic.
Yeah, all put together and making it work.
All right. Okay, should we call it down here? Thank you.
Good conversation starter.
Thank you.
Boring, English on the
Let's kind of call them in.
You want to pull it up?
No, I just want you to kind of like, let me just ask if there's anything you want to share.
Okay, for the next couple of minutes, some interaction and conversation with Jen.
No, don't want to
Or
force
Jen
it.
with interaction with you.
No, I'm just wondering if there's anybody who wants to share a story. Come on.
Okay, I'll share one. My grandmother on my mom's side her first language was French, and she lived in weibe, which is outside of Miramichi, or kind of know that way. And her father was actually originally Portuguese, and her mom was French, and she spoke French until she was about 6 years old, and then she moved into the inner community in Miramichi and had to attend school. So she completely lost her ability to speak French. And at 6 years old, she was completely trained to speak English, and in those days they didn't value keeping those multi-languages, which would be so useful these days, and it's such a shame because she doesn't have much memory of it. I'm not even sure that she would be able to decipher somebody else's conversation any easier than I would these days. So it's kind of sad that people lose their language so quick.
So quick, right? Yeah, I heard that over and over again this summer. And sometimes it was the parents were like suppressing the language. Don't use that language. Like, you need to assimilate.
Because they wanted to be normal.
They
wanted to
didn't
be seen as integrated people.
Yeah, especially the French English in New Brunswick. Yeah. What? Anybody else?
Well, now that you're saying, I find it weird that when I want to talk to my kids, like the other day we were at the open house and I was trying to explain what we're doing next, but I didn't want the person standing in front of me to feel bad, so I would talk to them in Spanish and then translate. So I'm explaining that this is where we draw, this is where we do our painting, and it's not like I'm trying to suppress, but I found myself using with them more English than I used to.
Okay.
Did they grow up
We're just
English?
not here. We're from Mexico.
Okay.
So yeah, they speak Spanish. Well, not that they speak like that. And now with the French and the English, the other one gets both and reads in 3 languages. But I find myself like explaining to them in 2 languages, not in a way to suppress my English, but like I don't want the other person to feel bad because I'm talking a weird language.
Okay.
So like if someone was there that just knew English,
Yeah.
so you didn't want to like feel like you were just speaking to this one person.
Yeah, like in the playground, like I'm not yelling, it's like, calm down! Saying it in Spanish and then in English, I'm just...
It's not interesting.
I'm not yelling at you.
That's super interesting.
Do you speak French, Jen?
Do I?
Yeah.
No. I've tried.
I was gonna
I
say,
speak a little Swedish.
If you did, you should visit the Port Peninsula in Newfoundland. They were essentially cut off. There were a group of people who came, I believe, originally from the Holland area. But they were essentially cut off so completely that by the 20th century, when Joey Small decreed that English should be spoken there, their language had no technical terms at all, so no word for a locomotive, a steam train, a sewing machine, anything like that. So it's actually one of the places where French scholars come over to study French as it was spoken a couple of 100 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah.
So you're explaining
Anybody else?
They also describe all the houses as the color of the house is the color of the trim, not the real. So the pink house is the house which could be green, totally green or totally blue.
With a pink trim.
Pink trim is the pink house.
Interesting. Karen.
Just to take off from Kristen's story, my dad grew up French and learned English in university, but his own father was completely bilingual because of the school system in his day that was half a day in English, half a day in French. So I don't know why that didn't translate down to the kids. But then my dad met my mom when he was in university, and she was completely non-bilingual, and it was a gigantic scandal that she was marrying my father. And for a long time she felt really alone because his siblings didn't speak a word of English. So whenever we went there was absolutely no communication. She tried too. And now they all speak English to us, which I find interesting considering what you said.
Skip the generation.
You know, like they really, English has kind of come in and seeped into their culture, and they're the ones who are making the effort. Like my brother and I speak a little bit of French, and we, parlay.
It's always the other languages that have to speak English instead of us taking the effort to learn that language.
That's right.
So my last name is Jeanette, but like Jeanette because it's French, but I don't say it like that. But my mom's side of the family, her dad was French, but he died when she was 6, so she just never learned French. But like my dad spoke French when he was young, but now he doesn't know how to speak it. And I begged my parents not to put me in French immersion, so I don't know how to speak either. But it's my biggest regret because like my grandmother, she's very French. She always called me fille and tutun and everything. So, and I'm always like, oh, I wish I knew what she was saying. I made it 2 years ago. Tutun meant little one, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. But she doesn't call me it anymore. So yeah, like I think my biggest regret is like not taking French. And I took it in university, but like there's not really any speaking. So like I know what shrimp is in French. But I don't know how to carry a conversation. So yeah.
We have to
Joe.
I find that really interesting how you're speaking about generations, how people end up losing it. But my own history with languages, and especially my mother, even in the same, in your lifetime, you'll end up losing your language to a certain point depending on where you live. My mother, she had moved to a completely English province at one point when she was younger, and she was completely French family. And now she's 50 now. She can speak a little bit of French. She can't write anything in French. She can't read in French at all. And she went to school and everything in French.
Wow.
Yeah, and then with me as well, I went to a French school all through my life. And then I moved here, and then I came from a French city, and then moved here, and then everything's English now. So I'm talking to my friends back home, and I'm reading what they're writing to me. I'm like, I can barely understand. So it's one of those things, unless you're constantly working with your language or whatever, you're gonna end up starting to lose it after a couple of years too.
Yeah. It's like World Flag Ant Farm all over again, just with English, right?
It's like that overarching, the kind of social dominant norm drives that too, because I guess if you're Maltese or Mi'kmaq too, and we talk about bilingual, and we have this innate understanding somehow that means English or French, it's really? Are they the only languages of the province? When you come from a colonized country, you realize that it's not just survival, it's been an imposition. And I think just like the waters rise, there is this global, slow resistance of decolonization in areas. And I think then you will get the ability and the freedom to be able to kind of realize and to practice, resist by practicing other languages.
I'm sorry, I know you want to, but we have to stop. So,
Thanks everybody.
maybe if we can pull out and go up this way, it makes that group easy to come in this way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bring your papers up. Thank you, Jen.